Germany stood at a crossroads, a defeated nation broken by economic turmoil, political division, and the emotional wounds of a lost war. Men and women across the country felt abandoned by their leaders and humiliated by the world. They feared for their families, for their futures, and for their nation's identity. In the ruins of the First World War, a dangerous idea began to take shape, one that promised to lift the country out of despair by offering simple answers to complex problems. Out of this environment emerged a man who would forever change the course of history. Adolf Hitler was not born into privilege, nor did he rise through brilliance or technical skill. His ascent came through emotion, anger, and the ability to articulate the frustrations of a wounded nation. He was convinced he understood Germany's suffering more deeply than anyone else, and countless Germans, desperate for a figure who could restore pride and direction, began to believe him. The story of Hitler's rise is not simply the story of one ruthless individual seizing control. It is the story of an entire society gradually surrendering its freedoms in exchange for promises of revival. When people feel threatened and powerless, they are more willing to follow anyone who offers certainty. Hitler offered a narrative that was powerful, seductive, and ultimately catastrophic. He said Germany was betrayed. He said enemies lurked everywhere. He said only he could save the nation, and millions listened. The early days of the Nazi movement were chaotic and violent. Political extremism dominated the streets. Communists, monarchists, nationalists, and paramilitary groups battled for influence. In beer halls, on street corners, and in smoky meeting rooms, radical ideas were shouted louder than moderate ones. It was in these environments that Hitler honed his skill as a speaker, capturing the attention of those who longed for strength and direction. His speeches were dramatic, emotional, and often filled with rage. But for many, his anger mirrored their own. The Nazi Party began as a fringe movement, but it grew because it gave people an identity. It convinced followers that they were part of something bigger than themselves, a mission to rebuild Germany and avenge past humiliations. It created a sense of unity, purpose, and belonging. And in a time of deep uncertainty, that was enough to draw millions into the fold. As the Nazi Party expanded, it transformed Hitler into more than a leader. He became a symbol. The party crafted an image of him as a man of destiny, someone chosen by fate to restore Germany's greatness. Propaganda played a central role in creating this myth. Posters presented him as strong and unwavering. Newspapers depicted him as disciplined and visionary. Rallies portrayed him as adored by the masses. Whether or not these depictions reflected reality mattered little. Perception became truth. Behind the scenes, however, the Nazi movement relied heavily on manipulation, intimidation, and strategic deception. Many Germans believed Hitler wanted peace, even as he quietly encouraged violence against political opponents. Many believed he respected the democratic process, even as he plotted to undermine it. By blending legal tactics with brutal force, the Nazis gained influence within the government while silencing those who opposed them. When Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, it was not the result of a sudden revolution. It was the outcome of miscalculations by political elites who believed they could use Hitler for their own purposes. They assumed he could be controlled. They assumed he would eventually calm down. They assumed his movement was more noise than substance. They assumed wrong. Once in power, the Nazis wasted no time reshaping Germany's political landscape. The Reichstag fire became the pretext to restrict civil liberties and arrest opponents. The Enabling Act gave Hitler the authority to enact laws without parliamentary approval. Independent institutions were dismantled or absorbed into the Nazi structure. Within months, democratic Germany ceased to exist. What emerged was a regime built on fear, surveillance, and total control. Every aspect of life became connected to the state. The press was censored. Schools taught the ideology of racial purity. People were encouraged to inform on their neighbors. The legal system became an instrument of political repression. Through a combination of propaganda and terror, the Nazis created an environment where dissent was dangerous and loyalty was rewarded. But the Nazi regime was not a monolith. It was a sprawling machine with numerous power centers, each competing for a Hitler's favor. This competition was intentional. Hitler believed that overlapping responsibilities and unclear authority would prevent any single institution from becoming too powerful. Chaos became a governing tool. Ministers, military leaders, and party officials vied for influence, creating an atmosphere where everyone felt compelled to prove their loyalty by pushing Hitler's ideology even further. At the heart of the regime stood the SS, led by Heinrich Himmler. Unlike the SA, which had helped Nazis seize power through street violence, the SS was designed to be an elite force built on discipline, fanatical loyalty, and ideological purity. Members of the SS were conditioned to view themselves as the guardians of the Nazi future, a future defined by racial hierarchy and absolute obedience. The Gestapo, the secret state police, enforced this vision through fear. People were arrested without trial. Homes were searched without warrants. Torture and executions occurred in the shadows. The mere belief that the Gestapo might be listening was often enough to silence critics. Rumors, denunciations, and whispered accusations could destroy lives. Fear became self-sustaining. Meanwhile, Joseph Goebbels transformed propaganda into a powerful weapon. He understood that, if he controlled the narrative, he could control the population's thoughts and emotions. He used newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, posters, and public events to saturate society with the Nazi worldview. Children grew up hearing that Hitler was a hero. Adults were bombarded with messages about national pride, racial purity, and external threats. Lies became truth through repetition. Underpinning all of this was the regime's core ideology, racial hierarchy. The Nazis believed that humanity could be divided into superior and inferior categories, and that Germans, whom they called Aryans, were destined to rule. This belief justified discrimination, exclusion, and eventually mass murder. Jews became the primary target, blamed for Germany's problems and portrayed as enemies of the state. But the regime also targeted Roma, disabled individuals, political opponents, LGBTQ people, Slavs, and many others. Nazi ideology sought to reshape society by purging everyone who did not fit its idealized vision. As the regime solidified its control, Hitler turned his attention outward. He sought to revise the post-war order and expand German territory. Step by step, he tested the international community's willingness to resist. Each time, he encountered hesitation. Germany rearmed. Little happened. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland. No one intervened. Germany absorbed Austria. No major response. Germany dismantled Czechoslovakia. Again, the world watched. These successes emboldened Hitler. He became convinced that foreign powers lacked the resolve to stop him. And so he took the next step, the invasion of Poland. On September 1, 1939, Europe plunged into war once more. Blitzkrieg tactics shocked the world with their speed and efficiency. Entire nations fell within weeks. The Nazi machine, strengthened by years of preparation, unleashed its full power. But military conquest was not the regime's only objective. In the shadows of occupation, the Nazis intensified their persecution. Jewish communities were forced into ghettos. Political dissidents were rounded up. Resistance was crushed with brutal reprisals. Forced labor camps filled with millions of people from across Europe. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 marked a turning point. It unleashed unprecedented violence. Einsatzgruppen units followed the army, carrying out mass shootings in towns and villages. Men, women, and children were murdered in open fields, forests, and ravines. These massacres were a precursor to something even more horrifying, the industrialized genocide that would become known as the Holocaust. The Nazi regime's descent into genocide did not happen overnight. It unfolded step by step, policy by policy, decision by decision, each one eroding human rights and paving the way for mass murder. By 1941, the leadership had become fully committed to eliminating entire populations they deemed undesirable. They framed these actions as necessary for the survival of Germany. In reality, they were driven by ideology, hatred, and a ruthless desire to reshape Europe according to their racial vision. In occupied territories across the East, millions of civilians found themselves trapped between brutal military operations and the regime's radical racial policies. Food was seized for German use, entire communities were uprooted, people were transported in cattle cars to forced labor camps. The Nazis saw the lands of Eastern Europe not as sovereign nations, but as space to be conquered and exploited. The inhabitants were reduced to tools of labor or obstacles to be removed. The ghettos became the first stage of what would evolve into a continent-wide system of extermination. Warsaw, Łódź, Krakow, and dozens of other cities were confined behind walls and fences. Jewish families were forced into cramped, unsanitary quarters with little access to food or medicine. Disease spread rapidly, bodies piled up in the streets. Despite the unbearable conditions, many ghettos developed rich underground cultures, schools, and resistance networks. People clung to dignity, even as the walls closed around them. But as the war intensified, the Nazis grew impatient. They wanted a faster, more efficient method to eliminate entire populations. Mass shootings consumed too many resources. The regime needed a system that would kill on an industrial scale. And so, the death camps were built. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, Chelmno, and Majdanek, names that would forever be associated with humanity's darkest hour. These camps were designed with chilling precision. Trains arrived daily. Families were separated immediately. Most were sent straight to gas chambers, disguised as shower rooms. Their belongings were stolen. Their bodies were burned. Their ashes scattered or buried. The process was efficient, impersonal, and horrifyingly systematic. Inside the camps, survival depended on luck, physical strength, and the decisions of guards who viewed prisoners as less than human. Starvation, exhaustion, disease, and brutal punishments claimed countless lives. Yet even in these conditions, acts of courage occurred. Some prisoners sabotaged machinery, some secretly documented atrocities. Some staged uprisings, like the revolt at Sobibor. Their resistance showed that even in the face of certain death, the human spirit could endure. While the Holocaust remains the most infamous atrocity of the Nazi regime, it was not the only one. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were left to die in open fields. Disabled individuals were murdered under the T for euthanasia program. Roma communities were massacred across Europe. Intellectuals, clergy, and political leaders in occupied territories were executed or imprisoned. The Nazi machine targeted anyone who threatened its ideology or its control. Back in Germany, life was shaped by propaganda, rationing, and a growing sense of uncertainty. At first, many citizens felt the benefits of the regime's early economic reforms and military victories. But as the war dragged on, the reality became harder to ignore. Bombs fell on German cities. Men were drafted in massive numbers, supplies dwindled. Families received dreaded letters informing them that a son, brother, or father would never return. Despite these hardships, open dissent remained rare. The combination of propaganda, fear of the Gestapo, and genuine belief in Hitler's leadership kept most Germans loyal or silent. Some resisted, quietly refusing to join party organizations, listening to foreign broadcasts, or hiding persecuted individuals. Others engaged in open resistance, like the White Rose Group, which distributed anti-Nazi leaflets, or the officers who attempted to assassinate Hitler in July 1944. These acts, though courageous, were exceptions in a society tightly controlled by the regime's apparatus. As the war reached its midpoint, the Nazi machine began to show signs of strain. The defeat at Stalingrad in 1943 punctured the myth of invincibility. Suddenly, the German public realized that victory was no longer guaranteed. Food shortages worsened, air raids intensified, morale weakened, but Hitler refused to consider peace. He demanded total commitment, total loyalty, and total sacrifice. Inside the regime, paranoia increased. Hitler distrusted his generals and often bypassed their advice, choosing instead to make strategic decisions based on intuition and ideology. This contributed to catastrophic failures on both the Eastern and Western fronts. Yet subordinates rarely challenged him, either out of fear or devotion. Over the years, Hitler had cultivated an environment where disagreement was viewed as betrayal. His inner circle had become an echo chamber. Meanwhile, the SS expanded its power, assuming control over security, intelligence, and much of the war economy. Himmler oversaw a vast network of camps and forced labor projects, exploiting millions for Germany's war effort. Conditions for forced laborers were brutal. They worked long hours under harsh supervision, with minimal food and shelter. Many died from exhaustion or mistreatment. The war in the East became especially brutal. Cities were destroyed, villages were burned. Civilians were massacred. The ideology of racial superiority turned military operations into campaigns of annihilation. German soldiers were encouraged to view Slavic populations as inferior. Orders were issued to show no mercy. This resulted in widespread atrocities, some carried out by the SS, others by regular army units. The boundaries between military necessity and ideological violence blurred until they were indistinguishable. By 1944, Germany's situation had become desperate. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Soviet forces were advancing toward Eastern Europe. German cities lay in ruins from relentless bombing. Factories struggled to produce weapons, oil supplies dwindled. And yet, the Nazi leadership continued to demand absolute obedience. The regime tightened its grip, executing those suspected of defeatism. Propaganda grew more frantic, insisting that victory was still possible. As Allied forces closed in, the Nazi machine became increasingly chaotic. Officials scrambled for influence. Some attempted to negotiate behind Hitler's back. Others worked to cover up evidence of atrocities. The system that once appeared efficient and unified now revealed itself as disorganized, corrupt, and driven by personal ambition. Hitler, isolated in his headquarters, issued orders detached from reality. Divisions that existed only on paper were ordered to defend entire fronts. Cities designated as fortress towns were commanded to fight to the last man, regardless of civilian suffering. Inside Germany, the human cost of the war became impossible to ignore. Families lived in fear of air raids. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers. Refugees fled from advancing armies. The regime responded by reinforcing ideological indoctrination. Children were sent to fight. Elderly men were conscripted into the Volkssturm. Propaganda portrayed these desperate measures as heroic acts of loyalty. In truth, they were signs of a collapsing system. By late 1944, the Nazi leadership of the war was lost. But instead of surrendering, they intensified their efforts to prolong it. Hitler believed that if Germany could endure enough suffering, the coalition of Allied powers might fracture, giving him a chance to survive politically. This delusion led to catastrophic decisions, like the Ardennes offensive, an ambitious but unrealistic counterattack intended to split Allied forces in the West. The operation failed, exhausting Germany's remaining reserves. As 1945 began, the regime entered its final phase. Cities like Königsberg, Budapest, and Breslau became battlegrounds. Civilians endured unimaginable hardship. The SS continued deportations and executions even as the Allies approached. In some places, camp guards forced prisoners on death marches in the freezing winter, killing tens of thousands. The Soviet advance into Germany brought additional fear and chaos. Many civilians fled westward, desperate to escape the front. Trains were overloaded, roads clogged with refugees. Entire families abandoned their homes with only what they could carry. The war had come full circle. Those who once supported the regime's promises of expansion now suffered the consequences of its collapse. As Berlin fell under siege, Hitler retreated into the Führerbunker. Surrounded by loyalists, he issued commands that no longer had any practical effect. His world had shrunk to a series of underground rooms, lit by dim lamps, filled with maps that no longer reflected reality. Reports of advancing Soviet troops brought him closer to despair, but he refused to flee. He insisted he would remain in the capital, even as the city crumbled. In his final days, Hitler blamed everyone but himself. He accused the German people of failing him. He denounced his generals. He raged at the betrayal he believed surrounded him. His ideological convictions remained intact, even as the empire he built collapsed. Legacy, pride, and hatred guided his final decisions. By April 30, 1945, the end was inevitable. Hitler ended his life in the bunker, alongside the inner circle that had remained with him until the bitter end. His death marked the symbolic collapse of the regime, but the suffering he unleashed would continue long after his final breath. Hitler's Germany was not a monolith held together by order, logic, or well-structured hierarchy. It was something far more chaotic, a regime designed to prevent anyone except Hitler from ever holding real power. The fragmented empire of control, multiple institutions that should have served similar functions, were intentionally overlapped. You had the Wehrmacht, the SS, the SA, the Party Chancellery, the Reich Chancellery, the Gauleiters, the Reich governors, and dozens of ministries all competing for influence, attention, and Hitler's approval. This wasn't an accident. It was the system. Hitler believed competition prevented unity against him. He once remarked that working towards the Führer was enough, that officials should interpret his wishes without needing explicit orders. This principle created what historians now call a polycratic system, a web of rival power centers, all pulling Germany in conflicting directions, but always toward radicalization. As one Nazi official wrote after the war, no one knew where authority began or ended. That was exactly how Hitler wanted it. The SS, Hitler's most loyal weapon. Among these power centers, one organization rose above all others, the Schutzstaffel, or SS under the cold, obsessive leadership of Heinrich Himmler. The SS was more than a police force, more than an intelligence agency, more than a military elite. It was Hitler's ideological vanguard designed to reshape society at every level. By the late 1930s, the SS controlled the Gestapo secret police, the SD intelligence service, the concentration camp system, racial policy offices, settlement programs in occupied territories, and its own armed divisions, the Waffen-SS. Himmler envisioned the SS as a new aristocracy, racially pure, loyal beyond reason, and completely indoctrinated. Training schools emphasized not tactics, but ideology. Cadets were told that mercy was weakness, that compassion compromised duty, and that loyalty to Hitler outweighed loyalty to humanity itself. This ideological training produced a cause capable of carrying out the most extreme policies of the regime without hesitation. The propaganda state, but brute force alone could not sustain the Nazi machine. It needed something more subtle, something that infiltrated everyday life. That something was propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, understood the human mind better than perhaps any other figure in the regime. He once said, "Our task is to reach into the darkness, to find the wavering soul, and to bring it back to the light." That light, of course, was the world as the Nazis defined it. Propaganda in Nazi Germany was not occasional. It was constant, immersive, and unrelenting. It was in schools, newspapers, radio broadcasts, children's books, films, and public marches. Even architecture, massive stone structures, colossal rally grounds, and torchlit ceremonies became tools of psychological manipulation. The goal was simple: to redefine what was normal. To make militarism feel patriotic, to make racism feel scientific, to make dictatorship feel natural. When lies are repeated often enough, they stop sounding like lies. That was Goebbels' genius and his crime. The economic engine of the regime. Behind the ideology, behind the terror, there was also a machine of industry powering everything. Nazi Germany's economy was neither socialist nor capitalist. It was a hybrid, a command economy built to prepare for war. Unemployment dropped dramatically, but only because millions of men were pulled into the military and millions of women were pushed out of the workforce. Rearmament projects, tanks, aircraft, U-boats, ammunition absorbed most of the nation's industrial capacity. But there was a hidden truth: Germany couldn't afford any of it. Rearmament was financed by debt, creative accounting, and plunder. Factories ran on stolen resources. Labor shortages were solved through forced labor from occupied territories. By 1944, over 12 million foreign laborers were working inside the German economy, nearly all under coercion or outright slavery. The Nazi machine did not simply exploit Europe. It consumed it, the cult of the Führer. At the center of all this ideology, violence, bureaucracy, economics stood one man, Adolf Hitler. But the relationship between Hitler and the German people was not as straightforward as later myth would suggest. Yes, he was popular in the 1930s. Yes, many Germans saw him as the savior of a broken nation. Yes, his charisma and speeches captivated crowds. But this popularity rested on censorship, intimidation, economic manipulation, staged events, and a carefully crafted image. Hitler rarely appeared in public spontaneously. Events were choreographed, crowds were screened. Cameras were positioned to create the most dramatic angles. He was not a leader among the people. He was a symbol above them. This cult of leadership allowed the regime to justify anything. If policies failed, Hitler was blamed by nobody because failures were blamed on subordinates or external enemies. If policies succeeded, Hitler received all the credit. He was portrayed not as a politician, but as a myth. A man of destiny, a heroic visionary, a flawless commander. The Nazi machine depended on this illusion. When the illusion cracked, the machine began to collapse. From popularity to fear. As the war turned against Germany, something changed. Hitler withdrew from public life. His speeches became rare. His appearances almost non-existent. Goebbels could no longer maintain the facade. Fear replaced enthusiasm. Propaganda shifted from triumph to desperation. Fight or be destroyed. Resist or perish. The enemy will take everything. By 1944, the Nazi machine wasn't held together by loyalty. It was held together by terror. The Gestapo roamed the streets. Courts sentenced thousands to death. Ordinary citizens were encouraged to inform on neighbors. Even children were indoctrinated to report their parents. A regime once selling the promise of greatness was now threatening annihilation. The machine turns on itself. As Germany collapsed, internal rivalries reached their peak. Himmler tried to negotiate secretly with the Allies. Göring attempted to claim leadership when Hitler became incapacitated. Speer sabotaged the scorched earth orders that would have destroyed Germany's infrastructure. Military officers plotted coups. Party officials blamed the generals. Generals blamed the party. The machine that Hitler had intentionally made chaotic finally devoured itself. In the final days in the bunker, Hitler raged that Germany has failed him, reversing the narrative he had built for 2 decades. But the truth was the opposite. It was Hitler who had failed Germany and brought disaster to an entire continent, the legacy of the regime. Understanding the Nazi machine is not just about understanding the past. It is about recognizing how systems like this form and how they sustain themselves. They are built on propaganda, fear, the erosion of truth, the destruction of institutions, the concentration of power, the targeting of scapegoats, and the gradual normalization of extremism. It rarely happens suddenly. It unfolds step by step, law by law, speech by speech, lie by lie. The story of the Nazi regime is a warning, a reminder that even modern societies with advanced culture, art, and science can descend into unimaginable brutality under the right conditions, and it reminds us that the most dangerous dictatorships are not the ones built on order, but the ones built on chaos, competition, and fear. The war machine, from Blitzkrieg to oblivion. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, the world witnessed something shocking. Not just the brutality of the German attack, but its speed. This was Blitzkrieg lightning war, a doctrine built on fast-moving armored divisions, close air support, coordinated radio communication, and the psychological shock of rapid collapse. But Blitzkrieg was not a long-term strategy. It was a gamble, a high-risk approach that worked only when enemies were unprepared and when resources were abundant. Hitler loved it because it created the illusion of invincibility. When Poland fell in weeks, when France collapsed in just 6, when the Balkans fell in days, the myth of the Nazi war machine reached its peak. German propaganda painted the Wehrmacht as unstoppable, an army driven by discipline, efficiency, and technological superiority. But behind the image was a darker truth. Germany was never prepared for a long war. Its oil reserves were limited. Its industry was decentralized and often inefficient. Its logistics were overextended, and its military was smaller than that of its major opponents combined. Yet Hitler pushed forward anyway, believing speed would compensate for resources, and conviction would compensate for strategy. Operation Barbarossa, the point of nitrogen monoxide return. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, thousands of tanks and aircraft, all driving deep into the Soviet Union. Hitler believed the war in the East would last 3 months. German generals believed 6 at most. They were catastrophically wrong. The Eastern Front became the very thing the Wehrmacht was not built for. Endless distances, brutal winters, impossible supply lines, and an enemy capable of absorbing massive losses. But Barbarossa was more than a military operation. It was an ideological war, a war of annihilation. Hitler intended to destroy Bolshevism, enslave Slavic populations, and seize the vast agricultural lands of Ukraine to feed the Reich. Behind the front lines, special SS units grew up and followed the troops, committing mass murder on a scale had never seen. Entire communities were wiped out, cities were starved, villages were burned. Millions of prisoners of war were left to die. This was not a conventional war. It was a blueprint for genocide. And it locked Germany into a conflict it could never escape. The overextended empire. By late 1942, the Nazi war machine was stretched across the Arctic Circle, the Caucasus, North Africa, the Atlantic coast, and deep inside the Soviet Union. There were simply too many fronts, too many enemies, too few resources. Hitler refused to retreat. He refused to allow flexible defense. He demanded that every inch of ground be held until the last man. This rigid style of leadership turned battlefield setbacks into disasters. Nowhere was this clearer than Stalingrad. Hitler saw the city as a symbol. Taking it became an obsession. When the Sixth Army was surrounded, German generals begged for withdrawal. Hitler refused. He told them they would be supplied by air. They were not. When the army collapsed, 90,000 survivors were forced into Soviet captivity. Only 5,000 ever returned to Germany. Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility and exposed the fatal flaw at the heart of the Nazi machine. Hitler could no longer tell the difference between strategy and fantasy. The SS stayed in the East. As the war dragged on, the SS expanded its role. It became not just a police force, but a colonial administration, reshaping Eastern Europe through terror. In occupied Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, the SS established ghettos, forced labor camps, mass execution sites, agricultural settlements for German colonists. Entire regions were emptied of their populations to make space for Hitler's vision of a racial empire. The SS controlled rail networks, food distribution, housing, and even private property. They were building a state within a state, a dark, brutal empire carved from the suffering of millions. Himmler openly spoke of resettling 50 million Europeans. This was not an exaggeration. Plans preserved in archives show detailed maps of which ethnic groups would be displaced, which would be enslaved, which would be Germanized, and which would be exterminated. Hitler imagined the East as the foundation of a thousand-year Reich, but in reality, it was the graveyard of his ambitions, the home front, life inside the regime. While soldiers fought abroad, life inside Germany changed dramatically. At first, the war brought victories, and those victories brought confidence. German citizens enjoyed luxuries stolen from occupied countries. Millions of foreign workers provided cheap labor. Propaganda spoke of unity, sacrifice, and destiny. But as casualties mounted, cracks appeared. By 1943, food shortages became severe. Bombings devastated cities. Families received death notices weekly. Entire neighborhoods were turned to rubble. Yet the regime doubled down. Goebbels announced total war, declaring that every man, woman, and child must serve the fatherland. Schools closed. Women were mobilized. Teenage boys from the Hitler Youth were trained for combat. Elderly men were conscripted into the Volkssturm, a last resort militia thrown against advancing Allied forces. For ordinary Germans, fear became the defining experience. Fear of defeat, fear of the Gestapo, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of being accused of defeatism. This was the true face of the Nazi machine, a system that fed on obedience until nothing was left. The final collapse. By early 1945, Germany was encircled. In the West, American, British, and French armies advanced steadily. In the East, the Soviet Red Army pushed relentlessly toward Berlin. Driven by vengeance for the devastation inflicted on their homeland, Hitler retreated to the Führerbunker, surrounded by loyalists, cut off from reality. He issued orders to armies that no longer existed. He demanded counterattacks from units that had been destroyed months earlier. He raged against betrayal, sabotage, and imagined conspiracies. Goebbels still spoke of victory in propaganda broadcasts. Himmler secretly attempted to negotiate with the Allies. Göring attempted a political coup. Generals surrendered without permission. Cities rebelled against party officials. The machine fell apart piece by piece. On April 30, 1945, Hitler ended his life beneath the ruins of Berlin. Within days, Germany surrendered. The thousand-year Reich had lasted 12, the aftermath and the reckoning. When the war ended, the world faced a question. How could a regime so extreme take root in a modern society? The Nuremberg trials attempted to answer this. For the first time in history, leaders of a state were held accountable not only for war crimes, but for crimes against humanity. The world learned of the camps, the ghettos, the mass shootings, the medical experiments, the forced labor system, and the infrastructure of genocide. The Nazi machine had left scars across the continent, scars still visible today. But Nuremberg also revealed something deeper. Most of the regime's crimes were not committed by monsters. They were committed by ordinary people, bureaucrats, officers, clerks, doctors, engineers, who allowed ideology to replace morality. This is the most disturbing legacy of the Nazi regime. Evil becomes possible when people stop questioning orders, stop questioning lies, and stop questioning themselves. The final lesson, the story of Hitler and the Nazi machine, is not just a chapter of history. It is a warning, a demonstration of how fragile civilization can be when fear replaces truth, and when power escapes accountability. If the 20th century taught us anything, it is this: dictatorships do not begin with violence, they begin with words, with small eyes, with small injustices, with small steps that seem harmless, until suddenly they are not small anymore. Understanding this regime is not an academic exercise. It is a responsibility. Because history does not repeat itself, but it does echo. And the echoes of the Nazi machine remind us that the fight for truth, dignity, and human rights is never truly over.